the office dilettante and minister without portfolio. And this has been a wonderful morning and a day altogether. It's really a great joy for me to be here, back in Vermont, thinking about the challenges that we all collectively are facing, and of course to see so many long and cherished friends. For much of the last decade, I've spent time in China thinking about their problems as they struggle with an energy transformation, a transition to a cleaner and lower carbon economy, while maintaining global industrial competitiveness and reducing air pollution and other environmental problems that the Chinese have. And of course, you see all this in the newspapers all the time. What never ceased to amaze me in China is that the challenges that they're facing, the fundamental nature of their challenges, are pretty much the same as the challenges, the nature of the challenges that we face here in Vermont and the region and pretty much around the world. And they are, and I'm oversimplifying here, largely institutional and financial. It's not technology that's our problem in the long run. It's all the other barriers to the transition that we've been talking about. So we brought this panel together today to talk about overcoming those challenges. What are folks doing? What are we thinking about? What are the initiatives and the efforts that are being made by a diverse set of folks here in Vermont and New England to move us forward on this path to, well, ultimately a low carbon and environmentally sustainable energy sector. This panel is intentionally informal. No slides. Each of our guests will have 5 minutes to talk about what he or she is doing in their respective work, and then we'll open it up to questions and, you know, I hope an energetic debate. But let me just introduce them first. Peter Walke. He's at the Agency of Natural Resources and is currently taking the lead for the agency and the administration in the Transportation Climate Initiative. Is that correct? He was also the chair of the Governor's Commission on
Climate Action Commission.
Climate Action Commission. Sue Minter at the other end is the current CEO of the Capstone Community Action Agency. Previously, she was the head, as you know, I'm sure, of the Vermont Agency of Transportation and the Hurricane Irene Recovery Officer in the Shumlin administration. Before that, she was a state representative, and in the interest of full disclosure, I was her campaign treasurer. And she was a member, and this is really, I have to say this, she was a member of the Waterbury Planning Commission, and I never learned more about land use planning than when she was on the commission. She brought great energy and intelligence and vision to the work that we did, and it was just fantastic. It was a real joy. Andrew Perchlik is a senator from, oh, come on, where's your seat?
I don't have it. You got enough people.
No, come on up. You come on up. I knew I miscounted. Jeez. Oh.
Here, right here. Of course.
His name was left off the program, and he thought that he...
I had gotten away with it.
I'm really sorry about this. Well, it's informal. Andrew Perchlik is a senator from Washington County, first-term senator. He is currently the head of the Clean Energy Development Fund here, operates that here in Vermont, and previously was the head of Renewable Energy Vermont. Let's see, Don Kreis is the consumer advocate in New Hampshire. He had previously been the assistant director of the Energy and Environmental Institute here at Vermont Law School. Before that, was the general counsel of the New Hampshire PUC. And this life of public service that he has been dedicated to was initiated by the influence of a camp counselor in the 70s who happened to be Howard Stern. Okay, let's see. Have I got everybody? Who have I? Oh, Mackay Miller. is the Director of Strategy at the National Grid in Massachusetts, previously with the National Renewable Energy Lab. And I've had the pleasure of working with Mackay for years, and in fact, it was mostly over the phone. It was only recently that I met him face to face. And we're really thrilled to have him here, of course. Let's see, whom have I missed? Oh, Kevin Jones, of course, Director of the Institute, and he'll be wrapping up the session for us. Just one last thing, this one small thought. This question of commute times came up, and the building stock in earlier discussions, and just two sort of fun facts to know and tell about China. Our office manager in our office in China is right in the center of town, a couple kilometers from Tiananmen Square. She lives about 4.5 miles away from the office. It takes her an hour and a half each day to get to work. Another interesting statistic from China is, this is a couple years old, so it's changed a little bit, but you get the order of magnitude is still there. There was an estimate, I think, about 5-6 years ago, that 85% of the building stock, 85% of the building stock in China, I want to emphasize this, in 2050 has yet to be built.
85%.
Okay? Now this is a powerful number. And the work that needs to happen, and Sue, you made me think of it, the opportunities to get it right are huge. The institutional barriers to it are even more so. And you can just imagine what they are, but one of them, of course, is local content and labor in building materials and in the construction process. Unlike the United States, China does not have a commerce clause in it, in whatever constitution it has, and the provinces actually discriminate against each other economically, a huge institutional barrier. But those aren't the problems we have here. I'm going to turn it over to our panel, 5 minutes each, and then we go to questions. I'm going to start with Sue Minter.
Didn't start with Andy. Slipped right in. Thank you. It is so great to be here. And Rick, I'm glad you reminded us of the good times of being on the Planning Commission together. He was the chair when I got kicked off summarily by our our select board. But that launched me into another career of being in the legislature, being in the public sector for really 15 years. And I think, you have stressed many times equity in the conversation, and I think that is why I am here representing really low-income Vermonters. I am so honored really just to be starting my 3rd month working as, not the CEO, the executive director of Capstone Community Action. We are one of 5 community action agencies around the state committed to social, economic, and climate justice. Coming out of the war on poverty in the 1960s, the Community Action Agency movement across the country, there's over 1,000 of us. The battle rages on. My life has changed a lot in terms of the lens through which I see the world now. Every day I arrive at my office in Barrie, a lovely new building that my predecessor left as a legacy, so that people can arrive to a place with dignity when they are standing in line in these temperatures to get in for food. We have the largest food shelf in central Vermont, and emergency crisis fuel and crisis housing. A big part of what we do is bring people in the door to help them through crisis, to stabilize their lives, and to move them through economic stability and security out of poverty. That's the mission, and we do it in very innovative ways. The work I do now touches on everything from food and fuel and early childhood development, running the Head Start programs, to economic security through some very innovative programs to help people build assets and opportunity, and into the world we're talking about today, building efficiency, specifically weatherization. I will also be touching briefly on transportation, which again, with my varied hats, is exciting and interesting to be a part of from this perspective. So the weatherization program, thanks to Rich Cowart, we have not only an efficiency utility, we have an investment into weatherizing low-income homes. We serve across the state. We are one of the 5. In fact, in the Northeast Kingdom, it is no longer the CAP agency, but there is still a specific entity serving the lowest income Vermonters up to 80% of AMI, average medium income. The truth is, we really don't get beyond 60% because our list is long, and the people between 60 and 80% are an unmet need that we all need to think about. I have data only for the last 10 years. After ARA, in 2008, I was on the Appropriations Committee in the House when the recession hit. And I cannot tell you the many, many ways that President Obama and the Congress, the Democratic Congress at that time, came to our rescue. One of the ways was actually investing in efficiency. And we had a very significant bump and got ourselves up to, at that time in 2009, on an annual basis for the next 3 years, weatherizing these lowest income homes, about 1,500 homes a year. Those dollars have gone away. We are now averaging about between 700 and 800 homes per year. Again, these are the very lowest income homes. But if you look over the decade, it's over 25,000 homes have been weatherized. Efficiency first. And I don't have the chart in front of you, but you can really see that the investments we make in these homes, which are often the most leaky, I guess, and hardest to hit, we are really getting the biggest bang for our buck. And of course, the most important thing is the multiple wins that we get through efficiency with low-income homes. We are saving Vermonters money. We are reducing consumption and fossil fuels. We are boosting a local economy and a workforce for jobs. And thanks to Karen Glittman, I have learned we are making our homes healthy. And there are some extraordinary examples. Rich Cowart, I had the extreme pleasure of driving down here, and he told me the story of going on some homes and taking a tour of a home. If it's okay, Rich, I'll share. He went into a home, and it was a dirt floor, and he was in the basement looking at what was happening. And the gentleman who was guiding him stuck a finger through, I believe you said, the heat exchanger, which meant that what was emitting in that home where the children were upstairs was extremely potentially toxic. This is probably not terribly unusual. He went to another home. A woman, an elderly woman, was so pleased the year before. She had had a weatherization investment, and she showed him the room where she slept. And he said, well, that's good. I assume you sleep in a room. Well, she said, but before, and she brought him down to the kitchen and opened the oven, said, I used to sleep on the floor with the oven open. I see the eyes of the people who live in those homes every day. And it is much larger than the bubbles that we live in. And it's really hard for us to think about our policies from their perspective, and that's what I'm learning to do. There are things that I want to say about our weatherization program very quickly. Many of you know Paul Zabriskie, who has been doing this a long time. He wrote me some things to say. I might get to it, but the crux is that where the silos that we exist in, policymakers, the weatherization that we do is really just conservation, and we are in the homes. We have all the information that we could be doing high-end efficiency performance work, but the silos don't let us do it. So we need to be thinking beyond, the parameters that the money we get, which is essentially from the Agency of Human Services, and into the Efficiency Vermont related services. So that is a policy conundrum and opportunity that I think is ripe for us. Just quickly on the world of transportation. So why are we here? Why is it important for a community action agency to be thinking about efficiency, energy, and transportation? First of all, transportation is the largest contributor, obviously, to carbon emissions here in Vermont. But it is also the largest, greatest barrier to getting people out of poverty in Vermont. So I do want to share the perspective of the importance of the electric vehicle penetration, but I want us to think broadly about decarbonization and different strategies for low-income Vermonters who, you know, I'm an urban planner. I've spent 25 years thinking about transportation planning, investing as Karen did, and when she was in the Secretary's office at Transportation, she really began in that tenure under Howard Dean a significant investment in public transit. We continued it under our administration. I hope it continues beyond. We have, as a state, invested highly on a per capita basis relative to other states in public transportation. However, the people I serve now, it's almost irrelevant. We do a lot to get affordable housing in centers and to make our centers pedestrian friendly, and we did a lot to improve fixed route transit, but the people who desperately need transportation to get to work, to get to childcare, don't have access. And it is a conundrum that I'm thinking a lot about. It's why I'm going to continue advocating for dollars that we're investing into electric vehicle, also gets invested into programs for getting used hybrids and used electric vehicles into the hands of these people who, just like in their homes, they're spending way too much on vehicles that are cheaper up front, but more costly over the lifetime. We used to have a program before it was cut, putting people into the hands of cars. We could be reigniting that program and using it specifically for used hybrids and others. So we're going to continue to advocate for that. And I'm looking forward to this senator and transportation on the Senate side continuing. I'll just throw one last thought. You know, I've traveled extensively, had the privilege around the developing world, and I've never had to have a car. The rest of the world, you can get around in jitneys, anywhere. We need to be thinking about models that work in the developing world here in our rural state. And so I've been thinking a lot and talking about, and maybe we'll be able to capture more, a rural Uber, a jitney service, a Ruber, where we use the technology that exists to actually think about jitney service to really serve the people who desperately need to get where they need to go. Every day they are choosing between food, between fuel, between gas. That's their reality, and I'm so excited to be thinking about them with all of you.
Thanks, Sue. Mackay, you're up.
Thank you all for having me. I appreciate the invitation. I drove up from Massachusetts today, but I used to, and I think I told the story when I was at the REV conference earlier this year, I used to chaperone high school debate teams to come up to the debate camp at University of Vermont, which has one of the best high school debate camps in the region. So good to be back up here. I direct U.S. strategy for National Grid. Our U.S. headquarters are just outside of Boston, but we're a UK company. They own and operate the high voltage electricity grid in the UK and the high pressure gas grid in the UK. Over here in the US, we are electricity and gas, basically from Buffalo, New York, over to Boston, and serving all of Rhode Island and all the way up into the Adirondacks. So that's our US footprint. I've been at National Grid for about 3 years. I spent 6 years at the National Renewable Energy Lab before that, thinking about very high renewable energy systems. When they brought me into National Grid, a big part of my job is to think about what are the low carbon targets for our region. What do they mean for our customers, for the states, and for us as a company? What would our business model look like if we were trying to help achieve these targets? So a big part of my job is to do the math, understand the speed and the scale required, and then to think through the implications for what a business would do to help meet that. So my comments will be brief, but I'm going to focus on what I think are the biggest problems, the biggest challenges, barriers to be overcome in trying to transform a utility business model from, let's say, a simple business model of putting infrastructure in the ground to a more socially motivated business model that helps achieve these targets reliably and affordably. So these problems are something I wrestle with every day. It's I'm generally optimistic, but not always. And I tease Rick a little bit because I feel a little bit curmudgeonly, perhaps early in life, early onset curmudgeonliness. And so I'm not, these are not all optimistic, but these are the barriers that I see. One is that we should not underestimate the speed and the scale. We saw some of those steeply declining graphs earlier today, but we are well behind in this region. And all of the work ahead is quite a bit more difficult than the work we've accomplished in the past 25 years. It is fairly easy to decarbonize electricity. Rich is right that it's not easy when you're doing it, but compared to what lies ahead, it is. Second, we should not underestimate the shift in capital flows that we're talking about. Capital flows dramatically into using and burning fuel today. That's really what Sue was just saying. It's hard to move that capital flow away from using fuel into capital stock that is super efficient, but that is the scale of the capital shift we're talking about. And that really challenges markets, and we have to really think about how well market structures can accommodate that. Third, there is a real and unresolved tension between decarbonizing energy and keeping everything affordable for ratepayers. When we go into rate filings, it is quite often that is the hardest thing to balance, and the regulator is struggling to balance this in all of our states. Should we be spending more today on electricity and gas bills in order to reduce carbon when, our customers ranging from Utica and Schenectady and Providence, Rhode Island, are struggling to make ends meet? And so that tension between spending more today to decarbonize and the poverty that we see in our service territories is real and is a public policy challenge. I've just got two more. We have an 80-20 problem in policy. Electricity emissions are well below 20% of emissions in our region in the Northeast, and yet they occupy a ton of policy attention and bandwidth. A lot of the cognitive bandwidth of the policy makers is focused on electricity emissions reduction. Emissions come from transport and heat, and that's where 80% of the policy attention needs to be, and it's not there. And finally, we don't think as a region, and we are a region. I got grumpy when I saw this duck chart earlier today. We are not California, and we should own it, and we should be proud of it. Our energy challenges are extremely distinct from California and from Colorado. We do not have 2 cents per kilowatt hour wind, and we don't have 2 cents per kilowatt hour solar, and we won't. And our challenge is going to be a winter peaking challenge, not a summer peaking challenge. As we decarbonize and we're running most of the cars on electricity, it's going to be winter nights that we have to worry about as a region. And solar's not going to help us there. We have to think really hard about offshore wind. We have to think really hard about what we do with our nuclear fleet. And we have to think really hard about how we get through those cold winter nights as a region and we keep 40 million people warm. So those are the problems that I see. Oh, sorry, one more. Am I over time? Probably.
You're fine, you got another minute.
I do think the utility business model is due for an overhaul. We went through, in this region, a big restructuring 25 years ago for a different set of reasons. That was not for a decarbonization push. That was for cost containment, and it was much needed. The question of what utilities should be doing in the broad sense and what their public interest role is urgently due for a hard look from regulators, but also the legal scholarly community needs to theorize this area more. There's not enough good writing about what utility regulation and utility business models should be in a decarbonizing world. And until we've got that sort of body of scholarly evidence, I think policymakers and regulators are going to have a tough time saying, here's where we go next. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot, Mackay. Andy, I do want to apologize again for the miscount on the chairs.
So I get 10 minutes.
You get 10 minutes. No.
All right, first I just want to say thanks for the law school and for RAP for hosting this. Last time I was in this building, it was a library, I think. I was meeting my then girlfriend, now wife, in here who was trying to procrastinate some law school studying that she was doing in this room. So it just made me reflect on the changes that happened over the 20 years that I've been involved in electric energy and clean energy work in the state. Things have changed a lot. When we started, the utilities were quite the enemy, and it was really just like, how can we get more renewables in there? And we've come around to where we have a very good efficiency program, first in the nation and leading the nation, and now it's established. There was a time when we were kind of worried about whether it would stick around, what different administrations might try to kill the whole program. But I feel like the efficiency charge and the work of Efficiency Vermont is pretty well ingrained into the Vermont ethic, and I don't see that going anywhere, and that's something to be thankful that's happened. And we have a really good renewable energy standard for our electric portfolio that we were able to pass 2015, and that's going to get us on the path to 75% at least renewable for electricity. And we have a situation where I feel like, even our current administration, Republican governor, is agreeing with the 90% renewables, agreeing with the renewable energy standard. All our utilities are, we might disagree with them over some of the details, but we're in agreement that our electric portfolio will get to 75 to 90% renewable. So it is a question about these other sectors. And we've since 2012, we started in the state talking about total energy, which we never talked about before. And I agree with what just said, that even though electricity takes up 90% of our policy discussion, or used to, I'd say, we're starting to switch that around. Electricity is now kind of moved off to the side because we feel like we've kind of figured that out. And with my hat as the Clean Energy Development Director on, we decided that in 2014-15 that we don't need to work on market transformation for solar and other electric renewables anymore, and we switched to the thermal market. And we switched to the thermal market because we had no idea what to do about the transportation sector. Everybody knew that that's where the biggest nut to crack was, but we passed on it. But I think since that was in 2014, in the last 4 or 5 years, this electrification and beneficial electrification has really come to the forefront. And I think there's now this change, and specifically if you look at the legislature, we have Kurt McCormick, long-term environmental advocate, and rabble-rouser, now the chair of the House Transportation Committee. He doesn't own a car. This is definitely the first in Vermont, and probably in the nation, that we have a transportation chair that doesn't have a vehicle, or doesn't have a car, because a bike is a vehicle, yeah. And the Senate Transportation Committee is, crampons. And the Transportation Committee in the Senate has been transformed as well, and are talking about things that have never been discussed in those committee rooms before about how we can do this. And I think Farnsworth quote about there's opportunity in the belly of the duck is something, even though we don't really have a duck curve. If you look at the Vermont curve, it's more like a camel. But the duck curve is nicer, I think, to talk about. But because you have this nice little idiom about there's opportunity in the belly of the duck, sounds better than there's opportunity between the two humps of the camel. So, but I'm going to write that up on the whiteboard in the Senate Transportation Committee as if there's a question, look into the belly of the duck, and there's going to be your answer about how we can do this beneficial electrification, specifically around transportation. And we have former, secretaries of transportation that kind of know the inside that can help us, and we have a Senate that really wants to figure it out. And so I'm really excited to work on it with my colleagues, both in the building and outside of the building, to figure that out. I think we have an opportunity right now to really lay the groundwork because we're not going to have this direct linear curve on those 90,000 vehicles, for example. We're only going to get another 2,000 or 4,000 next year before we get to 12,000. But we need to lay a good regulatory framework now so that in 5 years we can start doing 20,000. There's 40,000 vehicles purchased in the state every year. So hopefully, in a few years we can be really on the steeper part of that curve where we're doing 10,000 vehicles or at least some kind of plug-in in the state. And I also just want to say to Sue's point about kind of equality, we are looking, and what Chairman Cowart had mentioned is like on the dollar spent per carbon saved and what the benefit is to all Vermonters. And so we are looking at other options and trying to figure out what the best way it is to help all those Vermonters with their transmission needs as a dollar spent That also is going to give us that best carbon savings. At the same time, keeping our eye on the prize of a total electrified transmission sector. So there's a lot of different things that we could talk about. We're looking in about how we deal with transportation funding and things like that. But I guess I'll just leave it that we're at least talking about it now, which is an accomplishment compared to the past.
Great, Andy. Thank you so much. Don, what's happening in New Hampshire?
Well, thank you for asking. The first thing I want to say is that in the glorious summer of 1974, the summer I turned 16, Howie Stern told me that radio, I remember him saying this, radio is my chosen field, he said. And I remember thinking like it was yesterday, like, that loser isn't going anywhere in radio. So I am going to avoid predicting the future here, and I'm going to bring you 5 messages from the 21st state. And when I refer to New Hampshire as the 21st state, it's not the order in which we entered the Union, but our dismal ranking from the American Council for an Energy Efficiency Economy. You literally have to go south of the Mason-Dixon line before you come to another state with a worse ranking for energy efficiency than New Hampshire has. That is unacceptable to me as my state's ratepayer advocate, and fixing that is job 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for me every day I go to work. That said, my first message as New Hampshire's ratepayer advocate, and this is something I think I've probably said on this campus many times, is that whatever the latest buzzword is, whether it's resiliency or smart grid or fuel security, whatever that is, or beneficial electrification, ratepayers should put their hands on their wallets, because unless we are careful, these things become excuses for utilities to gold-plate their rate bases and recover windfall profits from captive customers. So in that regard, I am really gratified that the Regulatory Assistance Project has that tripartite criterion for beneficial electrification of saving consumers money over the long term, enabling better grid management, and reducing environmental impacts. Unfortunately, in New Hampshire, reducing environmental impacts is going to be a problem criterion for our PUC to adopt because, and my friend Ariel will remember this fondly, a year ago, our PUC said that it cannot and will not take environmental considerations into account when it makes decisions. I guess they did not read Professor Dworkin's memorable article about the environmental duties of utility regulators, either in its first or second editions. They should read that. Indeed. Points number 2 and 3 are 2 cool things that my office is doing to help move forward on things like beneficial electrification. 1, I am really passionate about revenue decoupling, which means rate designs that sever the connection. The thing that we're decoupling is kilowatt-hour sales or therm sales, amount of units sold by the utility, from revenue. A symmetrical visionary revenue decoupling plan can promote progress on public policy issues like energy efficiency and beneficial electrification, but it has to be symmetrical. We forced our utilities to agree to include a revenue decoupling plan in the first rate case they file after 2020. I know that's the best I could do, but then I convinced Liberty Utilities to include a revenue decoupling component in their natural gas rate case that we concluded last year. A big electric utility in New Hampshire, whose name I won't mention, but whose initials are Eversource, is about to, they're about to file a rate case, and I asked their senior management, so we're going to see a decoupling plan from you, right? And they all kind of looked at each other, you know, like that. We will force them to do revenue decoupling if it kills me in their rate case. That's point number 2. Point number 3, we are pursuing a legislative effort at the State House in Concord to force the utilities to start a single multi-use utility customer data platform. Customers need data to do the kind of stuff that I remember hearing Sue Coakley talking about this morning. The utilities don't want to cough up their data. We want to force them to do that. That same utility that will remain nameless but whose initials are Eversource, they're going to come in and testify on Tuesday that it's going to cost $50 million. They are wrong, and we will convince the legislature that they're wrong. Number 4, New Hampshire moves glacially on matters like beneficial electrification. In July of 2015, our legislature told the PUC, open an investigation about grid modernization. 10 months go by, then the PUC starts a grid mod working group. Another 10 months go by, the grid mod working group files its report. 2 years go by with nothing happens, and then just the other day, the PUC staff filed this big 140-page report about what to do next. What their idea is to do next is to transform, without statutory authorization, our least cost integrated resource planning process into something that I think is too inclined to put the utilities in the driver's seat. And again, the utilities are always looking to gold plate their rate base and recover windfall profits from captive customers. That is not good public policy, and we need to force the action on grid modernization quickly, but not in a way that's utility-centric. And the last point I want to make is that when you are next across the river, check out Liberty Utilities. They just got approval for a really cool pilot program that's going to combine time-of-use rates with Tesla Powerwalls for residential customers. We are leapfrogging over your friendly neighborhood utility, whose name I won't mention, but whose initials are Green Mountain Power. And we helped Liberty Utilities design that program. It's going to be really cool. I look forward to you admitting how successful we are being doing that. Okay, that's 6 minutes. I'm sorry I took 6 minutes instead of 5.
Don, that was terrific. Thank you. Okay, Peter, you're up.
Great. Thank you for having us here to wrap into the law school for this conversation. It's obviously a critically important one. I think the fact that we're having this conversation and you're hearing folks like Senator Perchlik talk about the change in the conversation at the State House this year, I think it's absolutely true. There is openness to talking about this that there hasn't been in the past. Transportation and building heat are incredibly difficult to deal with. We all know that, but we don't get there without talking about it first. I think one of the things that we are moving away from is this somewhat guilt-based conversation, right? You're either for it or you're against it, into if we're gonna get to the equity situation, how do we help people have solutions that work for them? And that we don't get there by beating them over the head to death to the point where they decide to do it. We have to help them come to those decisions and have the opportunities in front of them. And I think what Sue said is right. And I will just point out that, Sue, you're not the only one that Paul whispers in the ear of. He did the same thing to me the other day. So we will work on that piece for sure. And I think the other piece to recognize from what Mackay said is that we are not, and I think Andy hit it on the head when we moved away from renewable energy-based incentives. We're not thinking about the power production sector anymore. We feel pretty good there. We spent the last year plus at the Vermont Climate Action Commission where we didn't talk about renewable energy and energy efficiency really at all, because that wasn't where the challenge was and wasn't where the opportunities lie. I'm really excited that we are moving forward as of December with a year's worth of program design around the Transportation and Climate Initiative. I have the unenviable task of trying to herd our internal state cats and negotiate/work with nine total states and the District of Columbia. We're hoping that Maine will join shortly. We're hoping that New York will figure itself out and come back into the fold. We don't expect that to be a problem eventually. And to really make progress at the regional level. We do have the opportunity to lead and to push and to bring our shared experience in Vermont to the table, but we have more effect on the market and what happens to emissions if we're driving it at the regional level. It would be great to be doing it at the national level, but in the absence of that, let's move forward at the regional level. I'm excited to be part of that conversation. It's very much we don't really know what we're getting into at this point. There are a lot of pieces to the program design that we have to work on, and we don't know what the impacts are going to be. If prices are significantly higher than the prices are with RGGI right now, it could scare politicians and states away. So that's going to be a factor that goes into it, because ultimately that'll come back not to the ratepayer, but to all of us folks who drive around in vehicles and other things and eventually have to pay the cost. And so that's a huge factor brought to bear. We have good information that's out there now for the state of Vermont from the study that the Joint Fiscal Office contracted with Resources for the Future to do, provide us more information. I understand that our friends at the Regulatory Assistance Project are going to add to that level of knowledge with some information on how to use beneficial reinvestment to really spur the market. And I think, as we've seen with the RGGI process and was mentioned earlier, the cap has set the signal. The price has not driven the behavior. It's been a combination of low, cheap, available natural gas and the reinvestment in efficiency. As we mentioned, Vermont invested in efficiency, but didn't invest in electrical efficiency, invested in thermal efficiency, because that's where our need was, because we had worked out some of the kinks in the electric efficiency world, or we're working them out. And so it's exciting to see where those will go. I will say that there's a lot of question about how do transportation fuel providers become part of the solution? As we talked about, just with renewable energy, the utilities were resistant at first to RGGI, and now they're some of the best partners in RGGI because they see the business model and it makes sense for them. I'm not sure we're at that same place. When we talk about what Rich was saying about how his propane dealer is going to sell heat pumps, that sounds great to all of us, but it's actually not a great business model for them because they're not selling the energy behind the heat pump. Right? They make their money not on installing your furnace, but in delivering the fuel that fuels that furnace. And so as we work through all of these things, not just for the end user, but for the suppliers, what is their business model? We don't have to figure it out for them, but we have to set clear policy signals, and we have to put the other pieces in play in order to make it possible for them to make a transition to a different business model. Because they've been filling a need and been members of the community for a long time. They're not going to go anywhere, and we would like them to stay around and just do something else. And so there are lots of factors at play, but until we know and until we've set that policy signal, there's little motivation for them to get in that game. I think the same is true for the automobile dealerships. Right now, there aren't a lot of options out there. There's not a lot of point in them investing in learning about those options because most of us, when we go into a car dealer to talk about an EV, we know more about it than the salesman does anyways. If anybody has gone into a dealership, you know that. You're like, I was really hoping to have some of my questions answered, and I realized that the research I did on the internet was more than you can provide me. And we've got to change that dynamic. We've got to work with the dealers to help them and incentivize them to want to have those in the marketplace. The other piece is that the technology is coming, and most of the car manufacturers have made clear that they're not going to sell, they're transitioning towards plug-in hybrids, the like in a very short period of time. And so we're in this odd interim period where we really need to get people thinking about not necessarily buying an EV or a plug-in hybrid right now, but being ready to buy an electric vehicle when a model that more appropriately fits their driving needs enters the market. And that is not necessarily about market dynamics. It's not necessarily about some of it's about the technology, but a lot of it is just comfort and what people see in a vehicle and what the fact that an automobile is a lifestyle choice, and it has been for the past 100 years. We've made it that way. We've sold it as a lifestyle choice. That is not something we get over in a hurry, and the current models just don't meet everybody's lifestyle choice. So I think there's a lot of good that's happening here, and there's a lot of steam that's we're picking up steam rapidly, but there are going to be some major pieces along the way that we're not there yet. But I think TCI has the ability to help set that policy framework, but we need to know what the details are. We're going to be back to our leaderships in next December to say, here's what the details are, here's what we think is going to happen if we do this, and then they need to make a decision. And that's a timeline that scares the living shit out of me. I apologize for my language. I'm used to be a sailor. But it really, there's a lot of detail, and everybody wants to get to the sort of how do we deal with the equity concerns, which really deals with what do you do with the revenue. But the nuts and bolts of how it works and how it functions and how what pieces states get is the harder part to work out. And ultimately, we as the executive agencies in most of our states don't have control over where that money gets spent. We're going to advise the legislature on where we think it could go to make the most work, but ultimately that is a pocket, purse string decision, not an executive decision. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Peter. Kevin, you get the wrap up, and then we'll go to questions.
Great, thanks. So here at VLS, our energy program is focused on the laws and policies that are necessary for a clean energy transition. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things we've been doing here at VLS and some of the public policy choices, in my view, that are maybe holding us back and preventing us from taking advantage of the benefits of increased electrification. So here at VLS, we've made a commitment to transitioning to net zero place. It's gonna take us a little while, but we've been doing some important things. We're over 50% solar in terms of our electricity use here. As you came in, you probably saw our solar array. We have another solar array on our fitness center, and we have a 500 kW solar array 2 miles down the road that we take all the solar off that. We've also, if we were to think about our newer library compared to our older library that Andy talked about here, and we were there, and walked around, we'd see that we have installed cold climate heat pumps there. So all our most of our heating and all of our cooling is now efficient electric use rather than fully fossil fuel use. And for anyone that has an EV in the area, they know that VLS is an EV charging oasis here. And I'm very happy to say that given the state's Volkswagen Settlement Fund grant announcement recently, we're going to be tripling the number of EV chargers here at VLS. So we've been trying to do our part, and we'd like to do more. Well, one of the questions might be, well, what will we be doing next? Well, one of the things we won't be doing next is adding more solar. Unfortunately, in terms of our new net metering rules that went in place in 2017, the Public Utility Commission, not the legislature, but the Public Utility Commission put in a 500 kW cap on customers. So VLS is at 535 kW right now. We're a pretty modest user. So I don't know how we transition to 90% renewable when we have these artificial caps in place for our towns, our schools, corporate America, which has been leading the renewable energy revolution across the country, and even state government itself. So that's problematic. If we were to get rid of that 500 kW cap, we have some additional hurdles that the Public Utility Commission put in with those same rules, and that's, well, in California, customer-owned generation, solar and other distributed technologies are owned by the customer. The renewable energy goes to the customer. The utility's not allowed to take it. Here in Vermont, we have a public policy that puts significant penalties on the customer if they do not turn the renewable energy credits over to the utility. As a result of that, it's hard for us to go beyond the minimum levels and get to that 90% level because we can't have additionality from net metered solar. We also have a very big consumer protection issue in this state that people are going out and advertising, some of them solar companies, that they're doing low-income solar. We have small businesses that are advertising that they've gone solar, and they may not understand it. Some of them do, some of them don't, but because the utility's taking the renewable energy credits for the state renewable energy standard, the individual customers can't do that. And businesses that are doing, we've had students sitting in our energy clinic that are small business owners on small farms, and they've learned, from our discussion around the table that they've actually been making false green claims about that, and so that has to change. Similarly, when it comes to solar, one of the trends we have a principle in rate making that we call single issue rate making. Former Chair Cowart, former Chair Dworkin, I'm sure could lecture us at length about this, but with single issue rate making, we don't allow a utility to go in and change one component about the rate without looking at the overall impact on the rate for obvious reasons. I mean, they could go in and do a rate rider, and we want to fix this and increase rates while our rates should be going down. because of something else. I think what we've done in terms of solar is that we've really moved to single technology right making, where we're going out and we're pointing at solar as being the problematic problem for cost shifting and other things about that. But I wouldn't, I would encourage you not to accept that. And I'm sure National Grid's not doing this. But I've heard nobody complain about the fact that when I plug my electric vehicle in at night and I'm paying, 17 or 18 cents a kilowatt hour when it's maybe only costing, 6 or 7 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour, that I'm actually helping bring rates down, and I'm subsidizing a cost shift. So what we need to start looking at is overall those electric uses, and stop having solar being the problem in terms of cost shifting, because if we actually do better pricing and have dynamic pricing and smart rates, we can do things where we can actually increase the utilization of the system, clip the peaks by having solar. One of the things solar's done, it's pushed that peak later, and that peak tends to be lower. Now, what we don't want someone to do is to come home at 5 o'clock at night and plug their Tesla in, because that's going to be working in the opposite direction. If we have integrated policies, we can actually increase the throughput to the system. Because the biggest problem with the electric system is we have all this capital investment that's underutilized. So don't believe when people go after solar. So pricing is the next piece. We've talked a lot today about time use pricing and the importance of doing that. And so I won't say anything more there. But off-peak pricing and other things, some of the things I'm glad to hear in New Hampshire that the battery program is a combination of time use pricing and that. So I just had my 2 Tesla Powerwalls installed, and what I'm forbidden to do is to get on a time of use rate. So now I have no incentive. I have all this technology, these solar panels, this EV, level 2 EV charger, this 60 kilowatt hour battery in there, and my utility is telling me plug it in at 6 p.m. when you get home, which is the wrong time to do that, because we're not going to give you any incentive to do that. Very simple solution to solve. In California, the utilities have allowed customers, the EV is the appliance that you can best schedule at a convenient time that's off peak and not have it inconvenience you, because we park our car generally at night. So what do they do in California? They allow you to put a separate meter on and have your EV on an off-peak rate. Pricing, we really need to do that. Third-party ownership is one of the other areas that I want to talk about. Whether it's batteries or Fortune has so much solar, but heat pumps, we have to be very careful about having the utility monopoly that has the ability to erect barriers to other entities to get into the EV charging space or the battery space or anything else, because essentially what they're going to do is, and just the nature of it is, they're going to do things to keep the third-party suppliers out of it. And what we really need in this space is innovation, and we need the solar companies and the EV charging companies and other companies to be able to compete and provide these services. And we need to be very careful about that. The last thing I want to talk about is something we've worked a lot on in our energy clinic here, and that's low-income access to clean energy resources. Unfortunately, at the time that now we're getting some dialogue about bringing clean energy resources to the low-income community, we've gotten rid of a lot of the incentives that could help people get over those initial cost issues. And so I think we really need to focus on low-income access and do things to put some of those subsidies back. And one of the better ways to deal with the cost shifting is to bring the clean energy resources and technologies to all of the ratepayers, and not just those that can afford the upfront costs. So I'll wrap it up there and leave
Great.
it at that.
Well, thank you very much. Let's hand for the panel to start. I want to go directly to questions, and I won't ask mine, and I've got a bunch of them. But I hope it's clear from what we've heard from the panelists, all the interconnections between what they're working on and what others are working on. And certainly Kevin's very last comment goes right to Sue's opening comments. Questions of grid utilization go to some of the things that Mackay said. I'm just going to make one comment, and it may come back in the conversation as you ask questions, and that is, Mackay, I really liked your point about this 80-20 problem, and that most of the emissions that we're trying to deal with now are not coming from the electric sector in New England. And this is for many reasons for this. That, in fact, I see that as a terrific opportunity for clean energy electrification. So we have already a low carbon content, relatively low carbon content electric portfolio. All the more reason to electrify and meet some of these other objectives that we've been talking about. I'll leave that comment there, let it come back into the conversation. Questions? We've got a couple microphones around.
Rich Coward at RAP, but I really like this panel. You guys that's teed up so many good questions. I just want to make, I'll state it in the form of an observation and you can respond. Pretend it was a question. There was this comment, and that essentially, and I said it too in a way, we know how to do efficiency and we've made great progress on renewables, and so, we'll put them on autopilot for now while we struggle with electrification. And I want to respond to that by saying that what we're acknowledging is that electricity is now the heart of decarbonization. It's both in the power sector itself and in the transportation sector and the building sectors. And so if electricity is at the heart of decarbonization, there should be no autopilot. You all have touched on a dozen policies directly affecting electricity and its regulation that can't be on autopilot, that have to be solved. And I just wanted to emphasize that point and ask you if you would state it differently or disagree.
I'll respond to that first. You're right. And I simply meant that we've reversed the trend that we're now spending the 20% of our time on the 20% of the problem. I think you're right that it is the core of our work. But in terms of looking at not the new pieces, but the pieces we need to solve, that's where we're starting to focus more of our energy, and that's exciting to see. It's not that we're ignoring it. There's lots of problems and opportunities that still need to be worked through. But certainly, it's not on autopilot, and anybody who works in the energy field of Vermont knows it's not on autopilot. But it's a refreshing position to be in, I suppose, at this point.
Okay, did you want to add, Andy?
I was just going to say, from my perspective, part of the problem is the legislature sometimes has a hard time of walking and chewing gum at the same time. And so if we try to solve those problems on the efficiency and renewable electric sector, we're not going to be making as much progress in the transportation sector. So I think we have the luxury to kind of let it be on autopilot a little bit, but it's still the most important thing. I agree, efficiency, and we need to take the things that we've learned about the success of electric efficiency and apply those to transportation efficiency and building efficiency and really ramp those up to be equal. But I agree the point.
Just by way of timing, we're going to go about 13 more minutes in question and answer, and then we're going to have a closing chat, and we're out of here at 2:30. If that's okay, this dialogue is terrific. Please.
Hey, my name's Nicole. I'm a master's student here at Vermont Law School. I actually had a question that I want to ask during the last Q&A session, so I'll ask the panel instead. So the idea was mentioned that any carbon pricing program should focus on raising revenues and that it shouldn't really be about creating negative price signals because that would cause a switch from coal to gas instead of coal to renewables. And I just wanted to know if anyone could expand on that. Like why exactly? Why couldn't a carbon price, especially a substantial enough one, cause a switch from gas to renewables?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that. I'll channel Rich Coward here. Others, please join in. The issue here is how high the price is. Politically and economically, we're not about to tolerate a price that's high enough in order to flip altogether the investment decisions that people are making. It have to be very high prices for us not to, essentially, to disinvest immediately in coal or even in gas. What Rich said wasn't so much that the price was a problem. It's just that at the levels anybody's really talking about, it's not going to affect the kinds of change in behavior and investment that we're looking for. There's,
Yeah, I mean, carbon pricing is incredibly, efficient tool for internalizing externalities, and I just want to, and I think the problem is it's like saying, well, if we only invest half the money we should invest in energy efficiency, we're only going to get half of the benefit that we should do. So it's the same thing with carbon pricing. I mean, if you don't put a appropriate price on carbon, so that we're not expediting the switch to renewables being more cost effective, then it won't be very effective. So I would disagree a little bit with maybe the tone of it, but not the fact that we should be doing all these other things too. There's been some discussions. New York's looking at putting a carbon price in its electric markets, and I think it's going to have a very positive impact in terms of getting rid of some of the subsidies that they've had to put in for nuclear power and reducing the subsidies that are going to be needed for renewables. It won't solve the whole problem, but it's going to take an important step forward.
please.
I wanted to pick up, this is Sue, I wanted to pick up on a conversation we've been having about the additional benefits of building decarbonization, and how we link policies together. So not only do we have the climate crisis that we're facing a healthcare crisis. People cannot afford healthcare, and it's going up 7% per year, and it's unsustainable. We know that a lot of healthcare is driven by health issues that are related to poor air quality. So asthmas and so forth increase the amount of emergency room visits and lots of other issues. So how do we break down the silos? Andy, you talked a little bit about the need to break down silos and policies and programs. How do we begin to link improving and addressing some of our key healthcare issues, respiratory diseases would be a good start, with our climate solutions in terms of the building decarbonization in particular?
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, it's just a question on how best to do that. And I think there are some successes of there. People talked to, I think that was just early where we heard, there are hospitals writing these prescriptions for indoor air quality and looking at that. We're looking at that in other ways. And I'm hopeful that there are so many problems in our healthcare system and mental health care and other things that it's difficult to also put a burden on them about how to look at this. But I think with our Green Mountain Care Board, they can start to look at some of these costs in a more holistic societal way and say, this isn't traditionally what you might do at the hospital. Kind of as we've taken our schools and made them do a lot of social services, we should do the same with our hospitals and have them look at these things.
Yes, Sue.
I'd like to just follow up on that because we are starting to do that really, and I'm as part of a collaborative of human service providers really pushed forward by initially the healthcare reform that I remember being a part of in the legislature, the Blueprint for Health, but now we have accountable care organizations that are forcing our hospitals to be a part of and lead discussion on population of health and social determinants of health in all policy. And I see a real transformation happening in the University of Vermont medical system. They realized their biggest cost driver was a homeless vet who was diabetic and was a frequent flyer in their ER, and realized if we house him and give him wraparound services, we will all save money. So that's the kind of transformational thinking that I see happening, and I'm part of the same kind of conversation in the central Vermont area in my new job. So it's difficult, but I think it's beginning, and it is, I think, an outgrowth of the healthcare reform. Energy hasn't yet been in part of that discussion, although clean homes we're trying to bring into that discussion. So I see the link, and I'm glad you made it.
Okay.
One more brief note on this. The benefit cost analyses in Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New York are for utility programs are starting to account for the SOx, NOx, and CO2 particulate, or CO2 emissions, to put a value on those and to tally them up on the benefit side of the ledger, such that those programs that avoid SOx and NOx in particular, even from vehicles, have a stronger benefits case. That isn't to say that the regulators aren't still challenged to make a public argument that ratepayers should be paying for those public benefits, but at least at the BCA level, a lot of those local particulate pollutions are now being tallied up explicitly.
Peter.
And just to wrap it up quickly, I think the hardest part that we have with monetizing that health value is the data, right? We know that it has a positive benefit, and we know that people are willing to make those investments now at a pilot scale. What we don't have is the data to say, beyond sort of using the social cost of carbon as a stand-in for some of the health value. Right now, there's pilots going on both at the Rutland Regional Medical Center and up in the Northeast Kingdom with Efficiency Vermont and other partners to track that longitudinal data to say what is the actual health outcome benefit so that we can then integrate it into all of the work. But it is a silo issue. It is where does the pot of money come from? And how do we fix so that the flows, it doesn't matter, right? So that the weatherization programs that Sue's team implements, only a certain percentage can go to non-energy activities. There's all sorts of old electricity, asbestos, other things in people's homes that need to be dealt with at the same time. And if they can't be dealt, if there's not enough money to deal with those things, then they can't do the weatherization work.
So this was, hi, I'm Claire Valentine Fossum. I'm a JD Merle here. I'm also a research associate with the Institute. Mackay, you mentioned creating a new utility business model in a decarbonizing world. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective what that would look like. And then Don, I'm curious from a ratepayer perspective what that would look like.
Well, I think Don hit on part of it, is that if you want to get a utility to move, you have to put some cheese in front of it. At the moment, it's rate-basing things, and if we want it to be decarbonizing, then you need to think of ways to incentivize them to do that. We've come to multiple regulators with proposals to begin shifting us more towards a performance-based regulatory framework where CO2 reduction is an explicit goal of the utility, and we're actually compensated for going out, trying to find the highest polluting emitters, whether in transport or heat, and to convert them to electric uses. So we have electric heat pump programs in all of our jurisdictions that have some form of CO2 incentive where we tally up the avoided CO2, and that forms the basis of our incentive. As a fraction of our total earnings, it's minuscule. So we've not yet transitioned from a sort of we build stuff to we decarbonize, but you can see the seeds of it. I'd be very interested to hear from Dawn about whether it's if that is indeed the path forward to sort of shift utilities towards that sort of performance-based rate making.
Don?
I think the answer to that question is yes. I just agreed to join a task force on regulatory innovation that's being convened by the SEPA, the Sustainable Energy Electric Power Alliance. And I think we're going to look at ways to do that. I'm a pragmatist. In a perfect world, we would take the legacy electric companies and reduce them to platform providers on which other innovators and customers could build stuff. But the fact is that the utilities are with us. They are real players in our state's economies, even here in Vermont. I translated the phrase "show the rat some cheese" into Latin, and I inserted it into all the legal pleadings I make at our PUC because it sounds legitimate. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that there are significant differences between investor-owned electric utilities and natural gas utilities. National Grid, and I'm not just saying this because they're here, is a leader when it comes to innovating. I mean, they're out there in the world listening and talking to people and trying to come up with ways that they can adapt their business model to the 21st century. Green Mountain Power is another example. Liberty Utilities in New Hampshire is like that. Not all electric utilities are as open to change and reform. There are electric utilities in this country that are the current equivalent to the whale oil companies of the 19th century. They're going to be gone. The companies like National Grid are going to they're going to exist because they're ready to innovate and adapt. And as a ratepayer advocate, my job is to err on the side of doing stuff that will encourage them to innovate and adapt.
Right, in the back.
Hi, thank you. I'm Marion Major from Wyndham Regional Commission, and I work with the towns in our region on developing enhanced energy plans. And so this is bringing this conversation down much closer to the ground level. So a barrier that comes up in every single town is the massive challenge of a huge amount of fuel switching in transportation, and every town feels as if they're writing these policies and putting in these action steps, but not actually feeling like they can actually implement them. So I'm wondering, want to draw from the collective genius of the room, if there's any way I can help them more, especially considering that we're such a rural state and often low income is really the reality in these communities.
Well, I can say I'm from the town of Waterbury. We have a great town energy commission, or committee, LEAP, Local Energy Action Partnership, and we set some incredible goals that we met in terms of renewables. And now we're trying to set goals in terms of helping reduce people's reliance on their cars. And it's really about car sharing. And can we use the Front Porch Forum? Can we actually get some trust in terms of shared rides? I really do think that that is an opportunity that might be the lowest hanging fruit. But it takes some real innovative thinking. It takes community level, almost neighborhood level engagement. And I think the Front Porch Forum is an opportunity that we could utilize to do that. And we've been talking about it in Waterbury.
Go ahead. Last thing.
Just to add on what Sue said, we've been thinking a little bit about the rural transportation electrification issue, and one of the things we've been throwing around and trying to get funding for, which we've been unsuccessful to date, is to really looking at the solarized model for solar and try to apply it to transportation, because we think that there's a lot that can be done in terms of working with town energy committees and doing things to, because part of the education around EVs is just having people understand that they're actually really good cars, and what I think it was Kurt McCormick that mentioned Norway before, and one of the things they found in Norway is, well, as they've gotten more people into the car, it's just snowballed, because when your coworkers and your family and other people's actually see that this is very different than even driving a Toyota Prius. They're just really good performing cars. So we're very interested in trying to find some resources to work with the town energy committees to do education, gaming, trying to get the dealers involved, because we think working at the grassroots level to engage people about transportation electrification is one way to do it. Obviously, then on the the buses and other things, there's a lot of opportunity there. But I was talking to Peter earlier today about the challenges in Vermont, and in terms of funding and the economy of scale issues and other things that you don't have, it's a little bit trickier. But getting some of those more of the Volkswagen settlement money and other things in to buy down some of those costs will help there too.
One last question. That's you.
Yes, hi. I'm wondering, what model do you see for transitioning Vermont's electricity to 100% renewable with regard to distributed energy and Green Mountain Power? Our Energy Committee and others are looking at the necessity of facilitating a massive amount of local generation, and that means it's up to us to raise the funds, to find the land, to build the community solar arrays, and we're not seeing how it's going to happen.
I'm not a Vermonter, but I can take a...
I was just going to say, it's not necessarily that it's going to mean massive generation in all communities. I think there could be some more generation for sure around the state. I think we're going to see offshore wind that Vermont utilities are purchasing. I think as you do more distributed generation on rooftops and things like that, I don't think the communities, I know Act 117, which kind of deals with Marion's question too, is like they required the towns to take these energy plans on how we're going to get to 90% or 100% renewables, which is very difficult for small towns when they just look at all their people and the infrastructure that they have. So I think there's small steps that you need to take, and it is at the regional and state level that we need to look at the bigger problems, like where are we going to get the electricity? And if we keep on efficiency, we don't need any more. If we can just be continuing on the trajectory that we have as far as efficiency goes. And if we just do it smarter, like at nighttime and things like that, we don't need as much.
Peter,
can I just add,
well-
just add very, very quickly here? I mean, I think to honestly to get there, we're going to need some fundamental changes in our public policy. I told you about some of the things, the net metering rules, which, I mean, are essentially resulting in the solar that's being added, not really going to the community, reducing the community's carbon footprint. Our renewable energy standard, I mean, my energy clinic did a study for the Senate Natural Resources Energy Committee before the renewable energy standard went in place, and the study essentially said, taking state numbers, Vermont, 0% wind, 0% solar. Actually, we were 0.4% solar, but it got rounded off. And we could do another, if we did the analysis, given the way the renewable energy standard is set up, I could tell you what the answer to that study will be right now. It'll be 2035, Vermont 0% wind, and Vermont 10% solar, because the structure of the renewable energy standard essentially says all our large-scale solar and all our large-scale wind will be exported to the other New England states. The only solar that will happen in Vermont for Vermonters is what's required under Tier 2, particularly because the utilities, the incentive is that utilities are taking all the customer-owned generation solar for that too. So we have fundamental flaws in the structure of our system to really get to 90% renewables that are local.
Peter, and then we'll finish up.
I want to wrap on a positive note, and it's actually an answer to the previous question, was about how do you help your local communities? And I think the sort of rural question gets thrown out a lot. I want to flip that on its head, because unlike lots of places where we have people driving lots of really short trips, the opportunities for beneficial electrification in the transportation sector, both in public transit and in EV usage and electric bikes, is tremendous, because we have people who are driving, a fewer number of people driving longer distances. And we can see greater benefit from those trips being transformed to electrification than we get in other things. So the rural piece can't be a barrier to people's thinking. It isn't actually an opportunity in disguise that we're just not sort of wrapping our heads around. And that is about having other people see that it's possible, that my neighbor has one and that he gets to work and he loves driving this car because it's super fast and got great pickup and whatever.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just add one point, and that is one subject that didn't come up in this, but Mackay's comments alluded to it, at least for me, is the role of national transmission policy in all this, and how that will affect how we can utilize our grid more efficiently and, of course, move more renewable power around. We'll save that for another time. I want to thank the panel. Please join me in thanking them. That was terrific. Thank you. And thank you all. My understanding is one closing. Is that correct? Please.
Hello, everyone. I think it says a lot about what a great day this has been that it's 2:30 and you're all still here. So thank you for being here. I'm Jenny Rushlow. I'm the Associate Dean for Environmental Programs here at Vermont Law School, and I'm relatively new here. I came here in September from being at Conservation Law Foundation in Boston for a while, where I worked on a number of issues, including electric vehicle deployment and energy policy. We're doing some exciting things here at VLS, as I know Professor Jones has talked about. One thing that I want to mention to you all while I have the mic here is that we have a new podcast coming out this week called Hothouse Earth that's focused on heavy-hitting environmental law issues and how they apply to most people's lives. So it should be quite accessible, and there's some stickers by the door if you'd like to subscribe this week so that you'll get the first episode when it comes out. So to close up, today we had a really excellent discussion about the beneficial opportunities presented by electrification of end uses, as well as the policies that are necessary to make sure that electrification is implemented properly. Whether it's electrification of water heating, space heating, or transportation electrification, it's essential that our public policies ensure that increased electrification expedites our transition to a low-carbon future. As discussed today, if done correctly, electrification can offer significant environmental benefits and also enable better management of the electric grid and offer consumers financial benefits compared to the higher cost of more inefficient alternatives. It can also address longstanding equity issues in these areas. Presenters today have offered much for us to think about in regard to these issues, such as how to take personal decisions and turn them into collective action, how to design incentives, policies, and infrastructure to allow us to decarbonize transportation and buildings, and that we must squeeze the decarbonization issue from all sides with efficiency, conservation, and electrification, and that we must do it now. In closing, I would like to thank our panelists and speakers, as well as the citizens, legislators, government officials, and students who joined us here today. Finally, I'd like to thank David Farnsworth and Rick Weston of RAP, as well as Kevin Jones, Mark James, and Molly Smith of our Institute for Energy and the Environment here at VLS. Thank you for organizing today's discussion. Thank you all, and I wish you an enjoyable weekend.